Bom, boa tarde, gente. Obrigado a todos por terem vindo numa tarde de feriado, no nosso horário alternativo do meio da tarde para o Meetup, mas acho que com certeza vai valer a pena. Continuando a nossa série de Meetups virtuais, junto com o grupo de Brasília, hoje representado aqui pela Juliana. A gente trouxe para cá, aí, alavancando a quarentena mundial, a Kate Laffan, com quem eu tive prazer de conviver mais ou menos ao mesmo tempo na LSI. Enquanto eu fazia o mestrado, ela estava concluindo o PhD, então, na verdade, eu tive algumas aulas com ela. E a Kate, ela vai falar hoje sobre sustentabilidade, ciência comportamental e organizações. Ela é graduada pelo University College de Dublin e fez um mestrado em políticas públicas e planejamento pela LSI e o doutorado em políticas públicas comportamentais e bem-estar subjetivo, que é outra área de interesse de pesquisa dela, também na LSI, e ao qual ela está afiliada mais ou menos desde 2012, em várias posições de pesquisa, como assistente de pesquisa e depois como fellow de pesquisa. Desde o final de 2019, ela ganhou a Bolsa Marie Curie da Comunidade Europeia, que é uma das bolsas mais prestigiosas na Europa para pesquisadores jovens, e também ela é Behavioral Science Fellow da OCDE desde fevereiro do ano passado. Então a gente tem um prazer muito grande de estar com ela aqui, e vamos conversar. A palestra vai ser em inglês, mas fiquem à vontade para fazer perguntas em português no chat ou quando a gente abrir o microfone, fiquem à vontade, mas vamos começar, tá bom? Kate, thank you for coming again, now in public and on record, and thank you, because I mean it's early evening for you, but please, over to you.
Thanks so much, Guilherme. And thank you for everybody who's in the audience. I really appreciate your time, especially because I'm aware that it's a bank holiday. So I'm very grateful that you're spending some of it with me. That's no small thing, so thank you for that. And I'm sure everything that Guilherme said about me just there was all nice. I'm assuming. But yeah, as I'm sure he flagged, my name is Kate Laffan, and today I'm going to speak to you about behavioral insights for sustainable organizations. So to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to try and address today, I'm going to begin by giving you a quick introduction to myself. It sounds like I already got a good introduction, but I might just tell you where I'm coming from on this particular topic. And then I'm also going to go into the idea of using behavioral science for organizations to begin with, touch on the idea of environmental sustainability and why that might be important, and then thinking about, okay, if we were going to use behavioral science to address sustainability issues, what would we target, and some ideas around how we might intervene. And then I'm going to have way more questions than answers in this presentation, so I'll address or highlight some of those in the going forward section. And please, if you have questions as you go, please let me know. I'd love it to be informal and a kind of a discussion rather than just a delivery, if possible. So to start with then, behavioral science for organizations. Well, I think it's safe to say that lots of the applications of behavioral science that we'd all know about have focused on individual behavior and on consumers, and have looked at really policy implementation issues rather than anything else. And so the really famous examples that I'm sure we all know of are things like organ donation, things like consumption of electricity, for example, but also defaulting people into savings plans, into retirement plans, all of them really focusing on the individual level. But of course, all of the world's challenges aren't only at the individual level, and lots of the policy issues that we face involve an interaction between people at the micro, meso, and macro level. You can think about consumers interacting with firms who interact and are subject to legislation, and all of these interactions are interesting and important in terms of policy outcomes. And so as the field of behavioral science matures, I think it's fair to ask the question, well, can behavioral science speak to those sort of higher level questions of interactions between actors across those different levels? And are there reasons why we might think that they could? So there is this nice quote from an organizational psychologist, Schneider, and some colleagues that says, the people make the place. And this is almost too obvious, but it kind of suggests the idea that organizations are made up of people in the end of the day. And there are lots of ways that we can think of delivering organizational change through influencing the people who make up those organizations. So if you want to think about addressing leaders or important people in positions of a lot of power within organizations, those are the people who act as role models, but they're also the people who are in a position to often change the organization's policies and practices. So that's one target. A second target then is to look at supervisors and people at a managerial level, because those are the people who see policies being enacted and followed through on and complied with within organizations. So they might also be worth addressing. And then more generally, you can just think about employees in an organization. All organizations will have social norms that dictate how you should act in an organization and the things that an organization value and action through their values. And so we can think about also trying to influence enough people within an organization to create a shift in social norms to achieve organizational change. So at all those different levels, there seems to be some reasons to think that behavioral science can say something, particularly if we think of behavioral science as the science of understanding why people do what they do and shaping how they act. Then there's the question of, well, is there evidence from any other areas that suggest that behavioral science can offer practical insights for decision-making and management within organizations? Now, there is an increasing body of literature, but there's also been a long history in organizational psychology of demonstrating that we can learn a lot by trying to understand the behavior of people within organizations to promote organizational goals. So there's lots of research on things like teams, on creativity, on leadership, on inclusivity. There's lots of these different areas where organizational psychology in particular has had lots to say about changing and understanding the behavior of people within organizations. Unfortunately, however, when it comes to environmental sustainability, we don't have as much to go on. It is not an area that behavioral science has been broadly applied to try to change the organizational behaviors or people within organizations. It's not that it hasn't happened, but it's not anything like as a developed body of literature as compared to those sort of more HR type initiatives. And that really is a pity because the environmental sustainability of organizations really matters. So unfortunately, I was looking for a Brazilian stat and I couldn't find one, but this is one that I've used before around the greenhouse gas emissions from the UK and the US. And this statistic suggests that 33% of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK and 17% in the US can be attributed to businesses in the non-industrial business sector. So, you know, that's only their buildings. Think beyond that of all of the ways in which organizations consume and act that have knock-on impacts for the environment. And it becomes really clear that it does matter how those policies or how organizations act. And there's lots of appetite from organizations around the world, including in Brazil, for real sustainable change. So you've got lots of really leading examples from people like the Unilever, who are planning to double their business in the next 10 years while halving their environmental impact. You've got other organizations like Microsoft who are pledging to be carbon negative by 2030. And there's also the Banco do Brasil, which I came across and seems to be doing this amazing work in and around what kind of financing they're providing and helping people with business plans through their financing so that their supply chains end up being sustainable. So there's really nice examples from all around the world. One of the things that I've noted though, is oftentimes when you look at the plans around achieving some of these really admirable sustainability targets, they tend to look at technology shifts and purchasing green electricity, for example. There's been a lot less said about the role of employee behavior. And I think that that's a missed opportunity. So in terms of if we were going to use behavioral science to try to address sustainability issues within organizations, where should we start? There's been a survey, an old survey now, but at this point there's a 2011 survey that looked across UK organizations, and particularly from the public and private sector, and looked at the kinds of greening employee initiatives that they had in place. And as you can see from the graph on the right, there's lots of initiatives in and around things like recycling waste materials, switching PCs off at night, there's far fewer that are looking at things like sustainable sourcing of food, making bans on certain objects within in an employee's environment, encouraging use of video conferencing software, for example. And if you were to take a general lesson from all of this, from this particular paper, I think it'd be safe to say that they're not really focusing on those behaviors that will have the greatest environmental impacts. Recycling is all well and good, and it's something that absolutely organizations shouldn't discourage, in fact, should absolutely encourage, but it's not really going to achieve a massive amount in terms of reducing the carbon emissions or carbon footprint of an organization, for example. And I think that's something that's worth saying about environmental psychology literature more generally, is historically it's often focused on behaviors that were easy to measure, that were easy to encourage in many cases, and has not paid enough attention to really counting on what counts and focusing on those behaviors that may be sticky, but in the end would deliver the highest and greatest environmental impacts. So that's something that's changing, but it needs to change both in organizations and at an individual level. To think then more clearly about what would matter, there has been a sort of a separate initiative that isn't related to the behavioral science literature around carbon accounting, and particularly carbon accounting around organizations. That's been a big push over the last 10 to 15 years, where there has been efforts to try to get companies and organizations to disclose, to first account for the different activities that they engage in and their associated emissions, and then disclose them. So there's an international protocol called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol that is a sort of an international standard that allows you to measure your emissions if you're an organization, and then a carbon disclosure project that allows you to make public those emissions to kind of hold yourself accountable. And there's been a real success with this project because it's kind of forced a lot of organizations to come clean, if you will. And once the data is there and it's public, it's often enough motivation to do something about it. I was heartened to see the fact that actually within Brazil, there's also an internal Brazil Greenhouse Gas Protocol program that is, I think, part of a government-led, but also sort of NGO partnership that is looking to carry out this kind of exercise as well with Brazilian companies. And so that's the first thing, is really trying to figure out what matters. So across an organization, where are the carbon emissions most heavily weighted? And that will vary very much across industry, across type of organization, or nature of employees and their workforce and the buildings that they're in. So each company almost needs to carry out this exercise to be able to understand where is the biggest bang for their buck if they're going to target initiatives, both with behavioral but also technological solutions. And what a greenhouse gas exercise or protocol exercise does is it divides up company emissions into 3 scopes, which I think is really helpful. It makes you think about the first scope of emissions, which are any direct emissions that come from your operations as a company. So things like if you have a trucking fleet, the emissions that come directly from those and the petrol that goes into those trucking fleet. Then you've got scope 2 emissions, which are all the emissions that arise from your buildings and the heating. So any office related emissions from kind of keeping the lights on, for example. And then finally, scope 3 is a catch-all. Scope 3 really amounts to all the indirect emissions that arise from a company's work. So all of its business travel, the food that it consumes, the paper that it purchases, and so on and so forth. So it really catches everything that doesn't belong in either scope 1 or scope 2. And carrying out an exercise that maps those different scopes of emissions really helps companies to identify where their worst kind of practices are. And just to identify, or to sort of make that case even more strongly, Walmart is a really nice example that was a leader in this space. So back in 2005, they sort of partnered with the Environmental Defense Fund and looked to try to understand its emissions across the house, and tallied up all of the emissions that come from all of the trucks that carry all of Walmart's goods all over the US. They also looked at the scope 2 emissions, which were related to the big giant supersized stores that they have. And then the last one, which was the real innovation in what they were doing, was they looked at all of the emissions associated with their supply chain. So everything that ended up on a Walmart shelf, and what were the emissions associated with those products. And once they'd done that really careful exercise, they came down to the conclusion that the vast majority of their emissions were arising from scope 3 emissions. So it was really a question of trying to optimize their supply chain and focusing on that. And they've since then, so that was 2005, since then they've put in place really innovative projects in trying to understand, and I guess put corporate pressure on their suppliers to optimize and reduce the emissions arising from their supply chain. And that's something that a big actor like Walmart can really take a lead on. But I think it's also important to think that smaller organizations could also carry out an equivalent exercise to better understand where their emissions lie. So that's kind of not behavioral at all. It's really just a hardcore econ, understand where your emissions are. Then there's a question of, once you know, what do you do about it? And here, what I'm going to do is really think about just providing some examples of ways in which existing research has spoken to questions around scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And I would like to hasten that these are not the only examples, they're not the best examples maybe even, but I do think that they kind of give a broad overview of the kinds of things where behavioral insights can speak to reducing emissions across the house. And yeah, I'm very interested to hear if you have other examples. This is something that's an ongoing piece of work where we're trying to collect case studies as well of that we will be able to present to people and organizations with a view to kind of demonstrating that this is a valuable approach. But yeah, I'm only going to provide 3, so I'd love to hear if you've got more. The first one that I'm going to talk about is in relation to scope 1 emissions. So if you remember, I said that was to do with your direct emissions coming from your activities. And the example that I have here is from Virgin Atlantic. So this is a piece of work that was carried out with 3 economists, one of them who was a colleague of mine at LSE, and 2, Robert Metcalf and John List, who were at Chicago at the time. And they partnered with Virgin Atlantic to try to understand the emissions from flights and whether there was a behavioral component that could be influenced. And you would think, or at least I thought before reading this paper, that something like the fuel consumption of a flight wouldn't have much to do with human behavior. But as it turns out, when these academics were working with Virgin Atlantic, it became clear that there were actually important behaviors that airline pilots engaged in that made a difference to their fuel efficiency. And those behaviors were, I'm broadly sort of summarizing, but those behaviors were, at the very beginning, they needed to calculate the correct amount of fuel that was needed for the flight. And there's obviously a safe range, but once they were more precise and more careful about the fuel, they could maintain a sort of a safety standard while actually being more efficient. There was also using fuel efficiently during a flight. I mean, that's the same is true of when we're driving. When you're flying in the sky, there's certain things to do with altitude and speed at which you're flying that have implications for fuel efficiency that the captains have control over. And then the last one was about turning off at least one engine when you're landing, when you're taxiing to the gate. And that's a behavior that doesn't make any difference in terms of you still get to the gate if you've got one engine on, but it matters in terms of the fuel consumption. It's actually a really important one. So what they did, having identified those important behaviors, they had a framed field experiment where they looked to influence those behaviors amongst 335 captains, which spanned over 40,000 flights. So it's actually a very large scale field experiment, even though it's only dealing with 335 captains. It went over the course of 8 months. It happened back in 2014, but they've just published the paper in 2020. You can think of a framed field experiment as just being a field experiment, which I'm sure many of you know already, but just that the captains were actually aware that they were in an experiment. So they did know that, and they were randomized into various treatments. The first treatment was really that they were just given feedback. So on those 3 behaviors, there was a control group that was told that they were being monitored. There was the first treatment group that was given feedback in a letter to their home about how they were performing. There was another treatment group where they were given targets of reductions around these behaviors and then given feedback in relation to those targets, as well as some information around tips as to how they could better improve going forward. And then the last one, which is really nice, is pro-social incentives. So this basically said they had targets as well. And then for each month that the captains were meeting the targets, the airline would donate to a charity on their behalf. And so they had these different ideas drawing on existing behavioral science literature around incentives and feedback to try to see whether they could shift the captain's behavior. And the answer resoundingly was yes. In the first case, just being monitored really mattered. So even those in the control group reduced significantly their fuel consumption, which would suggest that even monitoring might be a first step. But over and above that, then there was genuinely significant results in terms of both the targets and the pro-social incentives in delivering fuel efficiency for Virgin Atlantic. And it saved, over the 8 months, it saved a massive amount of CO2 emissions. I'm not even going to try and read that, but and about $5.4 million in fuel from very light touch incentives. If you think about the cost of something like sending a letter and the small scale donations that were sent in terms of pro-social incentives, it's a really cost efficient program. And a nice result from this that is also worth mentioning is in the pro-social incentive arm, there was actually an increase in job satisfaction amongst the pilots. So job satisfaction is one of those things that we know predicts retention. Retention is an important thing for corporates as well. And so here is an idea that not only delivers fuel efficiency and the savings, money savings and CO2 savings that arise from that, but is also having this extra benefit of making your workforce feel better off. So I think that's a really nice example. And when I was speaking to an LSE group about this particular paper, someone in the audience mentioned that they're now, from this paper, spinning out into a startup that looks to couple with not only airlines, but also trucking fleets and shipping to try to focus on scope 1 emissions using these sorts of behavioral insights. And I think it's a great idea and a kind of an untapped area. So yeah, would be very keen to see how that develops over the next little while. The next thing then is scope 2 emissions. This is a project that was carried out, a pilot project that was carried out at Yale University. I'm going to plug it now because I've really enjoyed it over the last little while. Yale University is a leader in kind of carbon pricing and in research on carbon pricing. And they've just, as of January, I think, launched a podcast called Pricing Nature, all around carbon pricing. So if that's something that is of interest to you, it's well worth a listen. But the reason I bring it up is because specifically as they were looking to sort of walk the talk, Yale University, based on the research that was happening there within its academic community, decided to try and put in place and really test out an internal carbon price. What they didn't want to do was roll it out gung-ho and just across all the buildings in the university. So what they did was, for those buildings that they had really good monitoring data, they carried out a pilot exercise with the building managers. So they were the kind of behavioral target of this project. And they looked to implement a carbon price of various different structures. So again, it was a frame field experiment. The building managers knew they were taking part in this pilot, but they were randomly exposed to different kinds of pricing, per se. So in one group, they were receiving just information, which was telling them about their CO2 consumption and giving them the price, but not charging the price, just letting them know how much it would cost if the carbon price was in place. In another treatment group, they had money that was collected and then 10% of it was returned to invest in energy efficiency investments. In another treatment group, they were given targets. And then in a final treatment group, they were given, there was a redistributive design. So essentially what that accounted for was the really good performing buildings in the university ended up being subsidized by the really poor performing buildings. And that created a nice design because it was a revenue neutral scheme, but it really created a sense of competition between the buildings. I'm sure as a building manager, you wouldn't necessarily want to be paying the energy bills of other buildings in addition to your own. So that was quite a strong lever. And indeed, when you look at the reactions, one thing to say is that all of the treatments worked over the control. So it absolutely is the case that having any sort of carbon price or even communication around what the carbon cost would be was effective. But by far and away, the most effective were those two at the bottom, so the targets and the redistribution, suggesting that, you know, taking in hard policy like a carbon price, but adding a behavioral lens can kind of produce these additional benefits. And so it's not the case that we only want to look to nudging, we want to look to think about how behavioral science can inform both policy instruments and changes to the choice architecture. Great. So the last example that I have for you now is scope 3, and that's obviously from everything else. So everything else that businesses might engage in. And a particular interest of mine is around food. So my current fellowship is looking at intention behavior gaps in food consumption at an individual level. High meat diets and large amounts of food waste have massive environmental implications. It's actually one of the behaviors that we can engage in that will have the most potential to reduce our environmental footprints. And so I really like this project from, well, it was Sainsbury's in collaboration with the World Resources Institute. Sainsbury's has canteens throughout its shops and for its own workers. And what it was interested in trialing in this context, the context of this study, was whether using appetizing meal descriptions could get people to choose plant-based options. So this was carried out with an online piece of research in a sort of an online experiment with a group of just online participants. So not with any consumers that would actually be eating the food, but it was kind of a pre-pilot testing, trying to ask, well, can using appetizing language, so for example, feel good breakfast or garden breakfast or super value breakfast compared to just meat free, which was their standard language, encourage people to opt for plant-based options. And what they found in this, at least online experiment, is hypothetical choices were in the direction of yes, using appetizing language did encourage people to opt for these. And so this is a nice example of when you can't carry out, or you can't in the initial stages carry out field experiments, how you can user test in order to achieve, or at least produce insights that can then speak to the field at a later point. And the Rural Resources Institute has been a big advocate for this kind of appetizing language around vegetarian options. And they're pursuing this work with other companies like Google. They're also working with Waitrose. And so there's a lot of appetite, excuse the pun, for this kind of research going forward. And you can see that even though it happened in an online context, it is speaking to real world problems that the organization faces. The last thing that I want to say then as well is just to add the idea that organizational psychology, more so than behavioral science, but if we put the broad lens of psychological and behavioral science on it, can also help to make the case for why we need environmental CSR. So there's been lots of really good research over the past decade or so that demonstrates that organizations that take leadership roles in terms of sustainability issues, that has an impact on employees' pride, which has knock-on effects on things like their intrinsic motivation, which is really beneficial for an organization. It also allows companies to attract people because it signals their certain values. So it offers a sort of an extra benefit to employees that are engaged in these kinds of issues and care about them. And finally, if insofar as organizations really care about their environmental impact and their environmental impact broadly beyond even their own roofs, it also tends to produce spillover effects into employees' personal lives. So there's good evidence to suggest that engaging with pro-environmental behavior at work and even having just a pro-environmental attitude or value system within an organization leads employees to then adopt those behaviors in their home environments as well. So lots of good reasons for it. And I think environmental psychology and organizational psychology can help make that case very strongly as well. But as I said, there's lots more we need to know. So they're my main examples of how it has been effective, but there are others, of course, but there aren't enough of them. And I think what we're trying to do with some of the work that I'm carrying out with the One Planet Network, which is a UN network trying to understand and map organizational practices in this area and understand the role of behavioral science in them, is to really collect case studies and more examples of how this is being done well, and also promote the use of behavioral science within organizational psychology. So with that, I have a little bit of a plug for a survey that we are conducting, where we're focusing on organizations and we're really asking questions about their existing environmental initiatives, trying to understand whether they're using behavioral science or if there's an appetite to use behavioral science. Also, because behavioral science is always leaning heavily on the need for evaluation and, where possible, randomization and randomized controlled trials, trying to understand the sort of level of knowledge around that and whether that's something that we could support and help people develop, as well as trying to learn whether there's an appetite for a community of practice. So it seems like you guys have an amazing community of practice in terms of Brazilian behavioral scientists here. Equally, we're interested in developing the similar sort of thing for organizations that are interested in using behavioral science to support organizational change around these issues. So if you do know of any organizations that are doing innovative things in this area, or even would like to do innovative things in this area, please get them to fill in the survey. That would be a great help to us. And then I'll just finish with some questions that are outstanding that I don't have the answers to, but that I'm thinking about. So I'll invite you to think about them with me. So the first is, can organizations be nudged from the outside? And that is something around the lines of, well, if policymakers want to focus now at the only individual level, but also looking at trying to shift organizational behavior more generally, is there a role for policymakers to use behavioral science to do that? And there's some examples from other areas that suggest that it could be used, but there hasn't been much done. I think the best example of it is the Carbon Disclosure Project, where people are disclosing their carbon and then creating a sort of a descriptive norm around how people should be performing in these areas. But there's lots more that could be done in that space. The other thing that I maybe have some answers, but not that many, around are the implications of trends in new ways of working. So obviously I've been working from home for the past year. I'm sure some of you have also been doing so. And that really changes the role of organizations in promoting sustainability amongst their workforce. Or if it doesn't change the role of their organization, it changes their means. If people are working from home, you know, the sustainability impacts aren't happening under the employer's roof anymore. So that gives rise to challenges in terms of trying to measure environmental impact and trying to influence it. But it also, I think, produces opportunities around how they can engage with employees in this shift in a way of working that could promote sustainability goals, as well as other things like worker well-being. There's another piece around thinking about how data and evaluation can speak to these questions. One thing that organizations have lots of is administrative data, really interesting, valuable data that's often untapped around things like the travel behavior of employees, the purchasing within canteens. Those are the stuff of behavioral science dreams. And so encouraging organizations to partner with academics or partner with applied behavioral scientists in order to understand how to use that data, and use that data also in the context of evaluation of interventions as well. And then lastly, there's a question of ethics, and I think it's a really important one that I'm working. So I'm currently on my Marie Curie. I'm working with Liam Delaney and Leonard Lades, both of whom have really pioneered some frameworks around the ethical use of nudging. And they've been making me think and challenging my thinking around how can organizations in particular engage with employees in a way that's genuine to promote sustainability goals, but also ethical. Something that, you know, doesn't, particularly if you think of things like working from home, you're invading people's private sphere and trying to think about how to influence their behavior in their private sphere. And what are the ethical implications of something like that, and the sort of red flags. And so that's something that I'm constantly trying to work through and don't have all the answers on, but I think is very important. And certainly for organizations, legitimacy in this area needs to be considered. So to sum up then, behavioral science can offer insights to promote sustainability in orgs. Of that, I'm confident. Although I wish I had more to go on, but no, I am confident on it. And both thinking about what to target and how to target it matters. And if we think about psychological and behavioral science more broadly, we can think about making the case also for sustainability initiatives. And we can also ask questions about who is doing the nudges, the future trends in work, evaluation, and ethics. And I would sum up the whole talk in saying there's something that we are onto something, there is something there. And I do think there's value in thinking about behavioral science for sustainable organizations, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And so I'd welcome any ideas or thoughts or collaborations. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate. Awesome talk. I had the privilege to actually to be part of that one and at the LSC. So that's when I said, well, I have to bring her over to speak to the group here in Brazil, and it was just excellent. So to start with the questions, Artur, do you have do you have one that you would like to begin with?
Sure. Kate, once again, thanks for your great presentation. We would like to kick off the questions asking you to talk a little bit more about your project, the Mind the Gap research. We invite everybody here to enter the website and know a little bit about this project. If you could talk a little bit about it, would be great.
Sure, happy to. So it's kind of a different hat, but the Mind the Gap research is looking at individual behavior, which I still think matters, but specifically at a phenomenon called the intention behavior gap, which I'm sure many of you have come across. And I'm interested in it as it relates to environmentally significant consumption behavior. So as I was mentioning before, things like food, transport, home heating behaviors, these are the behaviors that we know have really big impacts in terms of your environmental footprint. And increasingly, lots of people are reporting having really good intentions in those spaces. So that doesn't mean going vegetarian overnight, but it might mean reducing the amount of meat that you have in your diet, or it might mean reducing the food waste that you throw out. Same is true of travel, maybe reducing the number of flights. There's lots of ways you can think about it. But often those good intentions don't always convert to action. And that's something that exists in all domains of life. It's not only in relation to the environment. It's been most researched in relation to health behaviors. So that's where we know the most, but I think it's just as applicable to environmental behaviors. And it has this nice property because often with environmental behaviors, there's a lot of influence placed on the idea of convincing people and kind of bringing them on board. Whereas here, in the case of intention behavior gaps, you've got this population of people who are already willing, they're just not managing to do it. And that from a policy perspective makes it very interesting because it's not a hard sell, it's really about supporting those people to fulfill their intentions. So my piece of work, particularly at the moment, I'm looking at meat consumption. And in the intention behavior gap literature, there's been a huge amount of work done on individual differences. So why do I fail where Artur manages to follow through? And we know a good bit about why one works versus the other. There's lots of individual differences that give rise to these gaps. But I think it's really almost intuitive. I sometimes feel like I'm researching the obvious, that it's not just about whether I fail and Artur follows through, but also about whether I fail today versus follow through tomorrow and how that changes over time. And so I'm really interested in what are the situational drivers, which speaks well to behavioral science, because behavioral science is all about context. What are the situational drivers that sort of get in my way? And how do individual factors interact with those? So that's what I'm working on at the moment, and it's an ongoing piece of work, but I hope to have some results fairly soon.
Great. And when we talk about the intention action gap, we tend to think about the individual. I think it's the natural thing to think about, but it seems like organizations can also relate to the same issues, like a small company trying to buy from a more environmental friendly supplier, which might be more expensive. Yeah. And sometimes a company or an organization can face barriers like a budget problem or some laws or some stockholder preferences. So how could we think about this intention action gap in the organizational level?
I think it's a great question, and it's one that I want to think more about, but certainly I think it's true that both organizations and individuals will display these gaps between their good intentions and their actions. I think what will drive those gaps will be quite different. As you say, there'll be budgetary constraints, which maybe actually do apply at an individual level, but there'll be other things that don't. One thing that I think from the literature around intention behavior gaps that's very relevant and is a nice way to think about it is that one of the reasons people fail to follow through is that they have conflicting goals. At an individual level, that's a super important driver of why these gaps emerge. And I think that that's true of organizations as well. One of the things that I've noticed in my work, I've been doing some work on carbon pricing, and with a carbon price, you're hoping to have both revenue generation, but also behavior change. Whereas if the revenue generation is happening, but no behavior change is happening, that seems to be that it's butting up against a different goal, where the carbon emissions are associated with behaviors that actually people aren't really willing to change or that are core to their business, for example. So while I don't think it's exactly the same thing, I think maybe some of the lessons that are coming from intention behavior gaps might be important to speak to these sorts of value action gaps that organizations have, and especially in and around conflicting goals, because I think even mapping those conflicts gets us closer to understanding where we can make change and where it's actually not very realistic, or at least in the short term, not realistic.
That's excellent. Thank you.
Great. Kate, one question that actually seeing your lecture again actually raised to me is that you mention in most of the examples that you give, and I assume that there are in the literature, they come from large companies and corporations. When in some economies, or maybe most economies, most of the employment is on small and medium companies, which is which they live in a bit of a limbo between the individual decision making and the corporate structure decision making. And just as an aside, I mean, I have a tiny company, and actually the year pre-pandemic, we decided, my partner and I, to let's just offset our travel carbon. We did, but it was actually a lot of work to actually implement it. And it was actually not so expensive compared, at least, to the ticket price of the airplanes. It was surprisingly cheap, but then again, surprisingly hard to actually go all the way through. So in terms of influencing and communicating and sort of reducing attrition for companies or to small organizations to become more sustainable, do you see initiatives or research done on that realm? I mean, besides the Unilevers of life?
So certainly there are small research projects. I haven't seen those big environmental initiatives being cited as often for smaller companies, because generally those companies won't have CSR departments, they won't have this outward facing thing. That's not to say that they aren't doing lots of good things internally. They're maybe just not advertising them in quite the same way. Having said that, what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me, and given the great importance of SMEs in sort of both employment, but then also environmental impacts, I wonder if there's a role for companies like Signal that I mentioned earlier, or even in policy cooperation, to try to facilitate smaller organizations that maybe don't have the capacity to run trials, or don't have, or large scale trials, but to help them in, for example, with carbon offsetting, facilitate that, or in trying to encourage them to engage with sustainable finance, for example. And maybe behavioral science can say something about adaptation at those SME levels that I hadn't thought about before, but I think is a really important, it's a very important point. I'm going to think more about it. But it is. And you're right that all the examples are coming from these big corporations that.
Fantastic.
Kate, I mean, taking a little bit of what Guilherme just added and thinking of the context that we live today with this pandemic, I mean, the pandemic itself forced companies to, work differently, right? And in theory, reduced its footprints. For instance, the World Bank that I work in was forced to reduce travel. Yeah. Consumption of water, energy, so many pro-environmental actions. So how working from home, another one, right? And we know that as we approach the new normal, or the whatever normal that we might get into, how could organizations, governments, or individual nudge or help organizations to keep these pro-environmental actions that they learned from the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great idea, and it's a great comment. And one of the things that I've uncovered, so I've been doing a little work on work from home and the sort of future of hybrid working and its implications for sustainability. And we don't have that much to go on, but the literature that we do have suggests that it's actually much more mixed than you might think initially. So one of the papers that's looked at this in particular in relation to travel, the obvious thing and the sort of the obvious win is that people aren't commuting anymore. But what they found is that had a spillover effect into people's leisure travel. So people were going gaga at home and wanted to get out and get away in the evenings and at the weekend. And so what seemed like an obvious sustainability win was actually having these knock-on effects on people's leisure travel. And so I think the first thing to say is that organizations should look to understand the implications of working from home. It's not that it's an obvious win. There'll be other behaviors that have sort of hidden environmental costs, like your digital footprint. So being on video conferencing all day long is actually something that does generate, even if it's not an obvious one, it does generate carbon emissions. So I think the first thing to say is that organizations should take a holistic view of, okay, what is this? It's obviously there's got some wins involved in it, but what are the other behaviors that aren't necessarily sustainable that will come from this kind of action? And then the other thing is that, unfortunately, it means that organizations don't really have as much sway. So you can think of those like obvious examples of Google and its canteens, and it really eliminating food waste in its canteens, or working very hard to eliminate food waste in its canteens. All of a sudden, people aren't eating in their canteens. And so Google's ability to turn around and have that behavioral influence is kind of gone to a large extent. And so you have to start asking questions of how can you be creative, or in a hybrid work context, how can you communicate with them on site in a way that spills over into their off-site behaviors. So there's lots of questions there. One thing I really would emphasize is just the role of organizations in kind of really facing up to the idea that this isn't necessarily, just because it's not happening on their roof, under their roof anymore, that it's not something that they should be looking to address. So yeah, we have a report that's just come out in collaboration, a colleague of mine at London Business School and another at LSE, on the question of sustainability from working from home. And we have, I'm sure many of you will know many of the examples, but we're basically using the individual literature on behavior change and trying to see how could it work in a work from home context. And so, yeah, there's more work to be done, but I think it's worth even just flagging it. It's very important.
Cool. Well, we could get one of the questions from the audience. Thierry, you made one. Would you like to get the mic open and do it in person?
Sure. First of all, Kate, thank you for the presentation. It was an awesome exposure for us. And I'd like to make a question regarding methodology. Mm-hmm. I mean, when we tend to focus on changing the behavior of a great company, the first question we should make to ourselves is, what is the micro choices that individuals make, and we may nudge them to make better decisions, and then we see what comes next. Mm-hmm. Or we should first of all think of what is the great change we would like to see in the great corporations, and then after that nudge people. I mean, we should come from the great size and then go to micro, or we should go starting from micro to see what can be done, and then a change path and a strategy regarding that. That's my.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'd be inclined, I'll tell you, my perspective would be that the carbon accounting type exercise, and that doesn't need to be, obviously in an ideal world, it would be a detailed exercise, but even based on sort of rough estimates of an actions within an organization, you would get a good sense of what are the big levers, what are the big important areas of emissions contributions, and then trying to think, okay, what within that is behavioral and structural. Having said that, so that would be my go-to or my sort of inclination. But having said that, I work with Faisal Nehru at the OECD, and he's done this amazing work at what he calls fostering a behavioral mindset in the organization. And he is very much of the mind that you can't always just come in and with a sledgehammer and, you know, top-down behavioral initiatives, this is happening, that it's really about developing capacity and, where possible, identifying these sorts of smaller wins in order to demonstrate the value of this approach, and then look to make more people aware of it, kind of bring more people on board, and then look to kind of build from there. So he's been more successful than I have at making behavioral mindsets more generally embedded within an organization, much more. So I'd say there's value in his thoughts on this rather than mine. But in terms of where to focus, so even if it was small projects in areas that matter, I think the areas that matter part is also significant in an environmental context. I'm so frustrated by seeing so many projects that have focused on behaviors that in the end don't make that much of a difference. So not a clear answer for you, but I think a bit of both.
Thank you.
Great. Also, Vera Rita asked to put a question forward. Vera is one of the deans of the behavioral science community here in Brazil. So everyone, probably 70% of the people on the call has been at some point a student or a pupil of Vera. So it's very nice for her to be coming to our meetup. So Vera, please.
Thanks a lot, Guilherme. And hi, Kate. Thanks for your presentation. Very interesting. I have a question, but first I'd like to make a quick comment on one of your last questions, how to nudge from the outside. something that I have been proposing. I call it the Fab 5 in English, not the Fab 4, but the Fab 5, 5 elements coming together. That would be heavy psychology and behavioral science inform public policy, consumer protection, regulation, and of course, choice architecture, which is, behavioral science itself. But having them all work together, because, for example, you can have regulation that is behaviorally informed,
Sure.
Nudge, it's more than nudge, but, give a little push into organizations for them to adopt whatever nudges that, would be designed for that. So if you have the whole thing working together, that might be a bit easier. Although, of course, it's a huge challenge, nevertheless.
For
Well,
sure.
and the question I have, when you told us about the pilot, the airplane captains, I was wondering, I started thinking about the psychology of scarcity. And I was thinking, what would their minds be like? I got a little restless thinking, if the captain of my plane where I'm flying, is thinking about saving fuel and how he should turn off the engine, but only after landing. But, would that be perhaps an overload for them? Or, actually the question is, would this level of individual psychology or psychological state be taken into account when you design nudges for situations like that, for instance?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. One of the design features of that experiment was that the reports were sent to their homes, which is not something that they go into much detail in the paper, but it's something that struck me as kind of unusual. Maybe it's the case that pilots don't have office addresses per se, and therefore that's the only way to get at them. But maybe it's also that they want to get them maybe not in a hot state when they're on flying, but maybe when they're in a sort of more reflective, this is more about my values way while they're at home. You could argue that that's maybe an unethical invasion of their home space, but I think it's interesting that they did it that way. And to your question of whether it could overload them, that I think is why it's very important to not only design with behavioral insights, but also with knowledge of the context. And so I think that's why partnership works very well within the behavioral sciences. I've been asked to work on projects on things like teaching in rural India, and I've come in and said, I know a lot about behavioral science, but I know nothing about teaching in rural India. And so I can't work on a project like that unless I'm working with somebody who has a lot more of that contextual knowledge. And also maybe even in collaboration with the populations, the target populations. So asking pilots and talking to pilots. Otherwise, I think that we run the risk of having these fancy tricks and ideas and actually missing the point or missing the bigger goals, like safety on an airline, for example. So that would be my thoughts on it. But even that, in the sense that people can't always introspect in the way that things are going to impact upon them, means that it's, not a perfect answer either.
Okay, have to think further.
Yeah, I have to think further. On your other comment on the Fab 5, I think that's exactly right. One of the things that I worry a little bit about the field is that there's an overemphasis on just thinking about how psychology and behavioral insights can focus on context and choice architecture alone, when it has so much more to say about all the different levels of policy, and also in terms of how people respond to policies. So it's all well and good to have a carbon tax, but if everybody responds really negatively to it and you end up with protests, then that's not a successful policy, even if it does attack a behavioral lever. So yeah, I really support all that thinking and would like to see more on it, to be honest.
Kate, I will translate or try to translate one of the questions that was made in Portuguese on the chat. It relates, it's a pretty good point. It relates to the issue of trust. Brazil being traditionally a low trust country. So Clegide asks, which tools could be better explored or will be best to be used in a context in which people do not trust institutions, whether public or private, which is very much the case of Brazil and several other developing economies.
Yeah, it's a really interesting. While I was prepping for this talk, I had a look around reactions to green products and green initiatives within companies within Brazil, and I came across a Guardian article. I don't know how accurate this is, but it said that Brazil was one of the greenwashing boom countries of the world, that there were so many organizations and so many products on offer that consumers had stopped even trusting environmental labels. There was also a huge number of existing environmental labels, like something like 75 criteria or something, you know. So I think trust is a really interesting one, and one that clearly these environmental initiatives can really backfire without. There's the whole issue of greenwashing, but there's also the issue of trying to be people feeling like they're being manipulated, which is something that's leveled at behavioral science all the time. I guess what I can counter, and maybe it's the standard answer that people give, is that there's nothing wrong with transparency. You know, in many cases, behavioral insights work just as well when people know about them as when they don't. And I think when it's organizations in particular dealing with their employees, it's really high stakes if you lose trust in the organization that you work for. The same is true if you're an organization looking to serve customers. We know that from the greenwashing literature that when customers are suspicious of greenwashing, that's something that backfires hugely, even more so than if they never did it to begin with. So I think trust is a really important one, and the answer to trust, at least in part, is transparency for me, but it's probably not the whole answer. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts.
Kate, so one more. So we talked about a little bit about the individual responsibility, but ultimately we know that the collective responsibility, it's something that we really, it's exactly this thing that will really bring impacts to pro-social, pro-environmental change. So organizations may be the drivers of these collective responsibilities. And in general, we know that many organizations will actually make change if we as individuals or society demand them to. Mm-hmm. So how do you see that we as individuals can, work on an individual basis or as a society to demand these changes from the organizations?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that I think it requires an understanding of behavior or pro-environmental behavior in a much broader sense. So a lot of the behaviors that I talked about today and the carbon accounting is all around behaviors that have these direct implications for environmental output and impacts. But there's also lots of behaviors that matter at an individual level and an organizational level that don't have these direct impacts. Things like advocacy, things like voting, things like campaigning, charitable donation towards environmental charities. All of those are sort of public sphere behaviors that we know less about encouraging and are certainly arguably in the long run more impactful than whether you decide to switch off the lights now or not. That can happen at the individual level in a society, but it also matters in organizations a lot. One of the things that I've enjoyed a lot at the OECD is that there's a huge greening community. And as I've been aware of their community, I've become aware of other organizations having these sort of environmental champions within the house. That are kind of holding their own organizations accountable and really pushing the boat to kind of say, well, there's these areas that you haven't addressed. And at least at the OECD, I've experienced them as being a force of nature. So they are these sort of eco champions within the organization that have really pushed the narrative on the organization that, you say you're sustainable. So what about this? And look to achieve change at that level. So I think at both the individual and employee level, there's lots that we can do. And there's probably more that we could do to try to understand how to encourage people to opt into those communities and stay engaged with those communities. If you think about the behavioral science literature, it said loads about volunteering, but not in that way. And so I'm wondering if there's more that we could work on in terms of how you initiate engagement with people in that way.
Kate, I would like to ask a question about the future. So we're heading to the future, and we know there's some movement around smart cities, and we know that you have some studies about the benefits of green cities for the subject well-being for the individuals. How could we nudge or push, for that matter, governments to think greener going forward?
It's a great question, and it does bring these two areas that I've worked on together in a way that I've not put together. So I'm interested to think about it. Well, one of the things that I think is inevitable is that cities are the future. There's already a majority of people in the world living in cities, and that's only going to grow over time. And so cities have these really nice properties that they can be made very sustainable, because you've got a lot of people in a small place, so there's lots of demand for public transport over car travel. When it's done well, it can be done very well in cities in a way that's harder in rural areas. But cities can also be very difficult places to live. I'm not sure, Guilherme, did you live in London while you were, probably not, while you did your MSc? London is an example of a fantastic city in many ways, but environmentally really very challenging. The air pollution, the public transport, it's not an easy city to live in. And green space is something that they do actually quite well. But having moved from London to Dublin, I now see the difference in my quality of life. And for those shifts towards urbanization to be sustainable in the sense of will actually last and can work, those cities need to be livable too. And so I guess I'm not sure how to nudge organizations to make cities more sustainable, but I do know the things that should be prioritized. And I would see those as public transport. I would see those as access to green space, clean air. There's a really amazing environmental psychology literature that goes way back about just the benefits, the unimaginable benefits that come from just living in proximity to green space. It helps you with dealing with stressful life events. It helps you exercise more. So those are the priorities. In terms of how to actually get it done with behavioral science, I'm not sure yet, but I'm going to think about it, because you're right, it brings together a lot of things that I've worked on. So I should probably have a think. That's
excellent. Thank you.
Well, we have another question from the chat. Anna, would you like to open the mic?
Hello, Kate. Hello, everybody. I work with a social organization. I work with education for social organizations, and the framework of our work there is the Sustainable Development Goals. And they are very useful. They are very actionable for them. And as you're saying, the sustainability happens in very different levels, in the global level, in the country level, in the state level, in the city level. And I say it happens in these tiny organization levels as well. Do you think the Sustainable Development Goals have the complete framework for one organization to start the discussion and maybe start implementing in its strategic, in everything? Because as much as we discuss social responsibility, when this discussion is closed in one department or one person, it will never, become a reality. It's just an action, one program that has a start and an end.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. For me, the sustainability or sustainable development goals are actually in a necessary way quite broad. So I wonder, for many organizations, are they almost difficult to try to target that many different goals? And I understand that there's this issue with siloed focusing on individual goals, and that can be a challenge, but equally for organizations, it's unlikely that they are able to address all of them. And that maybe for many organizations, what they might want to do is understand how their business operations and their sort of point of view matters to which goals and which are the priorities for them, where are their impacts most obviously seen. Having worked with the Sustainable Development Goals already a bit, it does feel to me like often they can be they're not conflicting goals in any sense, but they are many goals. And we know from psychology at an individual level, it's hard for us to target that many different things. And so, yeah, I would say that it's useful to have the whole set, and it's definitely useful for certain organizations to have that broad look across the set and to try to see where there are, you know, conflicts or sort of things that complement each other. But equally, at an individual level, I wonder whether it's better for organizations to focus on where they matter most in relation to those broader goals. That would be my sense, but happy to be challenged, happy to be disagreed with on that one.
Okay, thank you.
Well, just to wrap up the meetup today, Kate, if you, I mean, just pushing a little bit further the point on that Artur made about the sort of the intersection between subjective well-being and the sustainability research, and the interplay between those two domains, which sort of influence, have a sort of a cross influence on each other. I mean, how would I mean? I know that you have done some research on that prior on the effects of pollution and atmospheric pollution and social well-being. So what's the state of knowledge nowadays, especially coming to the point where in more mature societies than we have in Brazil, but I still keep pushing the team whenever I can. I mean, more and more the subjective well-being in and of itself is becoming more relevant and as a policy priority, as a policy goal, or sort of an end goal of policy. We are not quite there yet, but eventually we will here. But still, how does that interplay? The achievement of sustainability goals and the sort of the collective subjective well-being of societies.
So I think, or I would argue anyway, that they actually are very well aligned. One of the things that the subjective well-being movement or research suggests is that we really need to go beyond thinking about just GDP as an outcome for societal progress. And it's not the only thing that, it's not only subjective well-being researchers that are saying that, but it's certainly something that we lean heavily on, in saying that a good life is not necessarily dependent on just what you earn. A good life is really relates to many other things, like the quality of the environment that you live in, the social connectedness of your social group. There's lots of things in life that don't necessarily go hand in hand with GDP growth that matter for how people feel day to day. And if you really put a lot of emphasis on how people feel day to day and how they see their lives, you start to prioritize different things. And pro-environmental behavior is one really nice example, because from a sort of neoclassical economics approach, you would think about pro-environmental behavior as being a sacrifice. So it's something that you give up of your time, you give up of your money, and therefore you're almost asking people to make trade-offs between themselves and society, or environmental well-being, or the well-being of future generations. And it in large part in the narratives around pro-environmental behavior, for a long time it was kind of framed in that way. What we see from the subjective well-being research is that actually people who engage in pro-environmental behavior report higher life satisfaction, consider their activities to be more worthwhile. So we've emphasized the idea that how people feel really matters. We start to see that behaviors that are good for others and behaviors that are good for the planet are actually really well aligned with that. Much more so than being entirely self-interested and materialistic, because actually the adaptation level to material goods is really high. So while it might feel good in the moment to purchase something very flashy and expensive, that actually you get used to that very quickly, or you forget about it and you're on to the next thing. Whereas engaging with social relationships, but also engaging in behaviors that are moral in some sense, is something that continues to give people well-being benefits. And so I would say that, I would just summarize by saying that actually when you look at subjective well-being, and rather than GDP or other economic indicators, you start to see that sustainability and well-being are very well aligned. That's my big plug anyway. That's where I come from.
Perfect, excellent. I can't think of a better ending to our meetup today. As a final ask, we usually have our pictures taking. So whoever has the cameras closed, if you are able to open the cameras, we'll get a picture and circulate afterwards. So,
quem puder abrir a câmera, pessoal, a gente vai tirar uma foto.
o pessoal tá tímido hoje.
É.
Ok. Petros, Karine. Vamos lá. Letícia, dou-lhe uma. 1, 2, 3, cheese.
Smiling.
Say sustainability.
Sustainability.
Obrigado, gente. Thank you so much, Kate. It was really great having you here. It's getting late for you there, but thank you so much for a kind use of your time. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for your attention and all of the input. Thank you.
Very inspiring ending. Really loved it.
Glad. I'm off to bed.
Cheers.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a nice bank holiday.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Gente, obrigado. Espero que tenha valido a pena. E continuamos nossas séries para o mês que vem, 26 de maio. Artur, não sei se você quer já dar o... A confirmar,
a confirmar, 26 de maio, nós vamos nos encontrar com a professora Magali Delmar, que também tem bastante pesquisa na área de consumo sustentável e organizações sustentáveis, mas à medida que a gente confirmar o encontro, a gente começa a divulgação. Obrigado, pessoal, pelo tempo de vocês, pela presença, por ter prestigiado nosso 26º encontro, ou 26, para quem prefere números cardinais. É isso. Obrigado a todos. Bom feriado.